Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar titled "The Path to Peak Performance." I'm going to go through some concepts and ideas of how you take an organisation from where it is today through to an environment of operating at what we like to call peak performance. Just quickly on the Adhesis Institute, it's an institute that's been around for over 45 years, servicing thousands of organisations in nearly 74 countries, including 12 national governments working with presidents, prime ministers, all the way down to small startups, all the way through to large corporate organisations. And there's a long history of knowledge and learning that has gone into this methodology. And it was started by this gentleman, Dr. Ishak Adhesis, who is the founder and chairman of the Adhesis Institute, which is based out of Santa Barbara in California. Dr. Adhesis is quite an incredible gentleman with the ideas that he's put together and the simple concepts that help organizations, families, and like I say, even governments operate at much higher levels of performance. He's got 18 honorary doctorates from over 10 countries, has authored over 15 books, and so I'm really pleased to be able to share some of those concepts today. And a bit about myself: I'm the managing director of the Institute in Australia, and my background was in building organisations from a young age across Australia, New Zealand, UK, the Philippines. And like many other people in business, some things went well, some things went not so well. But I always looked for answers and ways of doing things better in the future. And I came across Adhesis a number of years ago. And it was just very powerful content that explained a lot of situations and became very helpful. So I loved it that much. I wanted to get involved full time, and what I do today is advise and mentor and consult to organisations in varying industries on these topics. So I'm really glad that you could be here today, and hopefully I can use some of my previous experience combined with the Adhesis methodology to help add some value. So I thought I'd just start off with this concept. Surviving is hard. Surviving in business is hard. There's a couple of little stats that I found online that if you have a look at here, the Fortune 500 firms, between the period of 1955 and 1994, the surviving firms were about 30% and new firms are about 70%. So it was about 8.5 new firms per year. But then fast forward to 95 to 2016, that's half the time, yet the rate had come close to doubling. So it means firms that are getting into the Fortune 500 are disappearing a hell of a lot quicker, and a lot more companies are coming through. And another stat here that, if a company was able to get into the S&P 500 in the early 20s, on average they would stay there for about 67 years. And now it's 15 years and it's getting shorter. And so if we think of some other big name brands like Kodak and Blockbuster and Dick Smith and now Toys R Us, BlackBerry, Nokia Mobile, so many big organizations have come, were successful for a period of time and then disappeared. And so for me, I've always wondered why that is. Because I think if you can understand why something occurs, then you can actually proactively do something about it, do something to resolve it. And so this slide here I sort of call Groundhog Day because I found it myself, and with a lot of business owners and executives that I work with today, we're at a certain point today, wherever that may be, and we want to move towards some future strategy. Some could be, new goals, new plans, new mission, new vision, whatever this future orientated place is. And we will normally plot a path, objectives. We can work backwards from the goal or the new strategy and cascade those things down. But more often than not, I've myself found, and like I say, people I work with, often we would either just fall short, or we would be in the same position, or worse, we would be further behind than we were when we started. There was something getting in the way. There was a set of crosses, so to speak, stopping us from achieving these new strategies, goals, plans, all of those things. And it wasn't, in my experience, I spent huge amounts with external consultants, millions of dollars, on some really good strategies, some really good plans, some really good initiatives. But often we would just fall short, and I find that's happens quite often. And the thing for me that I learned was that actually there's this anchor today. There's this anchor of problems, challenges, and conflicts sort of around the neck of the organization, holding it back. And I like the anchor analogy because a lot of these problems, challenges, conflicts are actually below the surface. They're actually quite difficult to see, yet they are holding the organization back. And so, in actual fact, if you want to achieve a new strategy, if you want to achieve a new set of goals, new set of anything, you first have to release these anchors. You first got to get rid of these problems, challenges, and conflicts, and you've got to be able to get rid of that friction so that way you can move towards that new strategy. Because make no mistake, if you're trying to do some really great strategic things or new goals or whatever it might be, but there's a big set of anchors around the neck of an organization, it's going to be very difficult to get there. And so if you were to sort of think about your organization and just think about the plans, the goals, the strategies over a long period of time, have you always achieved them? Have you always sort of achieved them in the time frame that you thought that you should or would? And if you haven't, maybe looking at this analogy and saying, well, yeah, what were the problems? What were the challenges? What were the conflicts that in hindsight I couldn't see? But as time went on, they became more apparent. And so what we really need to be able to do, I think, is be able to get better at identifying these problems and challenges and conflicts today so that way we can unlock them, so that way we can then move forward to our new strategy. And that's really where, the way we sort of describe it is first we need to identify what these problems, challenges, and conflicts are. We then need to categorize them because problems, challenges, and conflicts are not all equal. Some are manifestations of certain symptoms. Some symptoms are sort of the outcome of certain causes. And if you're not separating causes, symptoms, and manifestations with your problems, challenges, and conflicts, then you're not going to be able to have a proper treatment plan. And if you can't have a proper treatment plan, it's difficult to prioritize, which is the third component of it. Prioritization of a manifestation needs to be very different to a cause. One thing, if you fix it like a cause, it fixes other manifestations, but manifestations will continue to occur unless the cause has been resolved. So again, prioritization becomes really important. And then once you've been able to prioritize, resolving whatever problem, challenge, or conflict you found, and then repeating and doing it over and over and over and getting faster and faster and faster. And so in this world, there's a lot of conflict of definitions, and strategy and planning and all of that are sort of loaded with conflicts. But to me, this is really strategy, if you want to use that word, number one. First part of the strategy should be to get really good at identifying, categorizing, prioritizing, and then resolving these problems, challenges, and conflicts that are below the waterline. And once you've been able to do that, and it can take time, some organizations, it can take a couple of months to get really good at that, and some organizations takes a couple of years, and some might take a couple of decades, depending on the size and the complexity. But the key thing is that you've got to start with this process of identifying these problems and challenges before going to the big ticket items, before going to the big sort of challenges and the strategies, goals, and plans. Once you've gotten this working really well, then of course you can move to your new strategy, to your new goals, to your new plans. And so where do we start? Well, let's just have a look at why companies disappear. this is where we see the majority of reasoning of why companies disappear in the long term. Change is really where everything begins. Change, whether it be in the market, change within our perspective, change between our mindsets, change in a whole lot of areas. And change creates problems and opportunities. And problems and opportunities are sort of two sides of the same coin. An opportunity that you don't handle well becomes a problem. And by the same token, a problem handled poorly becomes a crisis. And so understanding that these problems and opportunities that we're constantly getting are coming from change is really important. It can be a change in consumer demand, change in technology, change in hardware, change in regulations, change in government, change in all sorts of different things ultimately leads to problems and opportunities. And once we have problems and opportunities, we need to manage those. And the thing with management is that that's going to then create more change. Now, managing is really just deciding what to do on one hand and then implementing that decision. But if it was easy, everyone would do it all of the time and everybody would just be living in the world of opportunities because managing this loop would be no problem. But there's actually these crosses. There's these issues that get in the way. And so often what we see is that either an organization's ability to manage slows down, so their ability to decide what to do and implement slows down with time, which means they're not reacting to change quick enough. So they're getting more and more problems and opportunities that they're unable to properly manage. Or their rate of management stays roughly the same, but their world changes faster than their ability to manage. The world starts changing faster and faster and faster. It creates more and more problems and opportunities. But if their ability to manage, which is decide what to do and implement that decision, doesn't speed up as well, that's going to lead to some issues. And so what are the crosses? What stops us? Well, we use a broad umbrella view and we call them conflicts. There's a range of different conflicts that get in the way. So let's have a look at those. The first conflict is a conflict of personal styles. If two or more people are having to manage this change loop and their styles are very different and it causes conflict, as in one person doesn't like the other person's style, doesn't like how they behave, doesn't like how they react to things. If you haven't got a way of harnessing that, it's going to slow down that ability to manage that change loop. People will be less likely to want to have conversations. People will less likely want to work with the person to implement. It slows down the change loop. And often what we see is young companies, often there's a saying that's founders and CEOs of young companies hire people they like or like them. And that's a lot due, I think, to this styles issue. People don't ordinarily like conflict, so they hire people without that conflict. But as a company grows and gets older and gets bigger, it needs to hire more people. So there's more likelihood to have different styles coming into the organization. And with the new styles coming in, if that isn't harnessed, it slows down that ability to manage that change loop. There's a conflict of interests. It's possible to get a commonality, aligned interest in the long term, but it can be quite difficult to get a commonality of interest, an alignment of interest in the short term. Often in the short term, people need to forego something. When you have a look at pretty well anything in an organization, if you're bringing in a new system, a new tool, a new process, a new product, and opening a new office, somewhere along the line, somebody generally has to forego something, whether it's shareholders, directors, management staff. And so if these conflicts of interest keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you aren't able to get alignment, again, being able to manage this change loop becomes quite difficult. There's a conflict of deciding versus implementing. If we think of management as deciding and then implementing that decision, there's a huge conflict because you actually need two different sort of energies and approaches. When deciding, you need democracy. You need a complementary group of people with different experiences, ideas, approaches, looking at this sort of problem from all sorts of different directions, and they need to be equal. They need to be able to have a say. They need to be able to bring their knowledge to the decision. But if you try and run a company like that via consensus with everybody being involved, implementing becomes almost impossible. To implement, you actually really need more of a dictatorship kind of energy. Now, I'm not talking about dictatorship as in a leadership style where you go around screaming at all of your people and you just act like a dictator. It's more that the energy is a bit more dictatorial in that, look, we've made the decision, we had everybody involved democratically, but now we are going to implement this. And so there becomes this conflict of when to use what, when should you use democracy, when should you be more in dictatorship mode, and the fact that both of those are in conflict. So again, if you don't have a way of harnessing that conflict, it slows down that ability to manage that change loop. And Adhesis has this word called democracy, is really what management should be about. It's democracy. Democracy in decision making, dictatorship in implementation, and really bringing those two things together to use them at the right time to ensure you're making really great decisions using the collective power of your team, but you are actually getting those decisions implemented. Because a lot of companies we work with, and in my own experience, are very good at making decisions. There's no shortage of decisions. There's no shortage of solutions. But actually getting them implemented can be quite difficult. Next, there's a conflict in the roles of management. In the Adhesis methodology, for those that have seen it before will know that the 4 roles that we talk about are around efficiency and effectiveness in the short and the long term. The problem with efficiency and effective, they're in conflict, and short and long is in conflict. And you have conflicts across those. Trying to get a perfect outcome for the short term and the long term and efficient and effective has a whole lot of inherent conflicts. So again, if you don't have a way of handling those inherent conflicts when you're trying to manage the change loop, because change doesn't really care about any of these things, change is just going to continue on. But if you don't have a way to harness, do I need to concentrate on the short term, the long term, effective and efficient, you're going to have a problem managing this change loop. There's a conflict of perceptions. Different styles, different people perceive things differently. It's not for today's webinar, but other webinars go through. There is want, should perceptions. Are we looking at it from an is point of view, a want point of view, a should point of view, and different personality styles? A lot of entrepreneurs, if you read books, there's this idea of the reality distortion field. That's because a lot of entrepreneurial people are talking about what they want, not what is today. They're more, this is what I want for the future. This is what I want my company to be. Whereas some people will really just generally concentrate in the is part of it. And then others are in the should part of it. And so if you don't have an alignment of those different perceptions, again, when you're trying to manage an issue through this change loop, those perceptions can create a problem. There's a conflict of definitions, and I must admit, definitions is one of the largest ones I personally come across, whether it's these webinars or I write quite a lot of content on things like LinkedIn and others. Conflict of definitions is just a huge issue because words are not really right or wrong. They either work or they don't work. And the problem with words or phrases or sentences, what it can mean to me can be totally different what it means to somebody else. And so if you don't have an alignment on those, you see so much energy going into people arguing and fighting about different things when actually they were talking about the same thing, but they were just using different words. And so if you don't have a process that really quickly gets alignment on those definitions, that slows it down managing the change loop. And then finally, there's a conflict of values. What I think is unacceptable behavior, somebody else might think is acceptable behavior, and vice versa. And so if you don't have that aligned, then that's going to further create issues in managing that change loop. And so really management, leadership, a whole lot of these different aspects are to do with managing these conflicts. Being able to manage the conflict, so then that way you can get faster and faster at dealing with all the problems and opportunities that are going to come from change. And so one of the interesting things is that these conflicts really don't care about the amount of resources your company has or the age of your company. If you look at, these big name brands that have gotten themselves into trouble, they had lots of access to public markets. They could tap shareholder funds. They could hire great people. They could do all sorts of things, and they'd been around for a long period of time. But over time, these conflicts got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they slowed down being able to manage this change loop. Their decisions became worse. Their implementation became worse, and ultimately, they just could not manage this change loop. And at some point, the businesses got into serious trouble. If they had found a way to harness that change loop, harness the conflicts, then they would have been able to manage that change loop a hell of a lot more. And it's just really interesting that if you look at your organization, when it comes to deciding what to do and implementing, just look at some decisions that have not been implemented and maybe have a look at these conflicts. Think about some meetings that generally go off track. Think about the different styles, interests, perceptions, definitions. Try and use these just to go back and say, okay, I can see that these conflicts are currently playing out, which is stopping my ability to managing this change loop. And the longer I leave my ability to manage this change loop, the further and further behind I am going to fall. And so what should you actually do? Well, what we've got to do is make conflict constructive. We are never going to get rid of conflict. And in fact, we don't want to get rid of all conflict. We just want to make sure that it is constructive, because if everybody thinks the same and approaches something from the same sort of direction, then the majority of people are redundant. What we need is all those differences, but we need those differences harnessed to be constructive so they're not destructive. And so ultimately in life, if we do nothing, we will generally get destruction. If you go and build the greatest garden and disappear for 12 months and not touch it, when you come back, that garden is looking pretty disheveled. Time equals change, and by definition, change is destructive. And so if we do nothing, we end up on this, Dr. Adizes describes it as this highway of destructive conflict, where you do nothing, these conflicts are going to get bigger and bigger, more and more destructive. What you actually need to do is look for the little signpost. You've got to do something proactive to make that conflict constructive. Because in reality, the input into the change loop doesn't come from the manage line. It actually comes from down here. Either your input into the change loop is going to be destructive, or your input is going to be constructive. And it's not really a case that you can just sit back and say, okay, well, I'll just choose one or the other. You've actually got to do the things that will lead to one or the other. You can't just say, okay, I just want it to be constructive. You actually have to do the things that will make it constructive. And that starts with this high level concept that Adizes sort of is the bedrock of the whole methodology, is this concept of mutual trust and respect. If you slow down and look for the signpost and do the things that creates mutual trust and respect, that is what is going to create constructive conflict. And the words trust and respect, again, thinking about the conflict of definitions, still use everything else that the trust and respect means to you, but specifically add these points to it. Firstly is that we share a common interest. So I will forego today knowing that I will be looked after in the future. And that's very important, because if you think of the majority of implementation failure, often you will see that there was a lack of alignment of interests, and the party whose interest it wasn't in didn't forego, wasn't willing to give up, wasn't willing to take the harder path. And so what trust is telling us to do, it's giving us sort of this beacon, is to create this common interest so that people can forego today knowing that they'll be looked after in the future. And respect is the undeniable right for someone to think differently to you, and you want to learn from the disagreement. That's really true respect. It's going into the meeting knowing that there could be some conflict, differences of opinion, difference of view, but your default position is, I want to learn from this difference. And so if you can build a culture of mutual trust and respect where you have this common interest that people forego, that when people get together, despite their differences, despite all of their different conflicts, they want to learn from each other, that's going to be what creates constructive conflict. And why is this important? Why is it important that we build a culture of mutual trust and respect? Well, it really comes down, I think, to energy. And the Institute has this, Dr. Adis has created this very good equation, which I'll take you through now, which is called the secret to success. Because it's an equation that sort of explains that everything that I described before, managing those conflicts, deciding what to do, implementing, just being alive takes energy. And the sort of energy available, and we describe this through integration, through external integration, where needs meet capabilities, where your clients really want your products, when your staff are highly integrated, where you yourself are integrated with what you're doing. That's when energy sort of comes and becomes available. And ultimately, what do we want to be able to do? Well, it goes back to that change loop. We want to solve problems really quickly, and we want to capitalize on opportunities faster than our competitors. And each of those items need us to decide and then implement those decisions. And so if you can concentrate on this integration, that's when you're going to have the energy really to do those things. But the issue is that we know that at any point in time, energy is fixed. There's only 100%. There's only 24 hours in the day. And we know that energy is predictably allocated. It's first, energy can't be destroyed, as we know, but it's sort of lost. It becomes unavailable through certain things. It gets consumed. So the example I would give is that if you're dragging a log across the ground, before that log will move, you first have to have enough energy to get over friction and inertia. If there's enough energy after that, then the log will move. And in an organizational setting, in a family setting, even in a country setting, that friction analogy is internal disintegration. It's when you're not integrated, it's when you're disintegrated. So it could be backstabbing, unharnessed conflict, lack of alignment of goals. I think if you can think about any situation in a corporate family or a national country level, there's these integration that first energy has to go and gets consumed by these negative disintegration bits, and only that is left can go outside to the integration aspect. And so if you look at your organization, if you're really integrated, so you've got a very small amount of disintegration, the majority of your energy, in this example, 95% of your energy can go outside through that external integration. And ultimately, what do we need to do? We need to manage that change loop, which is solving problems and capitalizing on opportunities. But if you're highly disintegrated, internally disintegrated, whether disintegrated between the ears, can I, can't I, not really sure, what will people think, or if the organization isn't integrated, if it's disintegrated, different factions, warring parties, a lot of destructive conflict, then very little of your energy can go outside to do those issues. And even think about countries. Have a look at countries at the moment. Those that are highly integrated with leaders that are driving an integration agenda are the ones that are really successful in getting stuff done. Countries that are disintegrating internally, all that energy is getting consumed. If you're a president of a country and you're constantly playing on Twitter and starting fights and doing all these different things, that's actively creating disintegration, which means by definitions there's just going to be less energy available to go and do those things, solve problems and capitalize on opportunities. So success under Dr. Adis's very, I think, very good equation here is a function of the energy that's first consumed through disintegration and that is left over through integration to ultimately solve problems and capitalize on opportunities. Now, the thing with energy, as we say, it's fixed at any point in time. We can't just manufacture it. So what we have to do is get disintegration down. And how do we do it? Through mutual trust and respect. And so if you can build a culture of mutual trust and respect, that's going to get that integration down. That's going to get the disintegration down, leaving a much more highly integrated organization that has a lot more energy. So I would suggest to you to look at your organization, look at your country, look at your family, look at a whole lot of things through this equation, through this prism, and say, yeah, actually, I can see a level of disintegration and that it is costing an ability to go and do those things. And to me, that's one of the first steps of understanding the value of mutual trust and respect. But the problem with mutual trust and respect is that you can't demand it. You can't buy it. You can't just, click your fingers and deliver it. Mutual trust and respect will only come from other activities. It is the outcome of other work. If you do the other things, mutual trust and respect is more likely to occur. And so you've got to understand that there's a sequence of ingredients that leads to mutual trust and respect. And I sort of often will use the garden analogy. I can't go to my garden and just demand beautiful vegetables. I will only get vegetables from my garden if I have the right seeds, good quality seeds, with the right soil, in the right climate, with enough water, if I'm able to protect it from pests and wildlife. A whole lot of different ingredients in the right sequence. If I dump all of the water on my garden at day one and don't leave any more water later on, what's the likelihood of getting good, healthy vegetables? And so mutual trust and respect is like that. If you have the ingredients in the right sequence over the right period of time, you will get mutual trust and respect. And so understanding those ingredients is what becomes most important. And so what are those ingredients? Well, today I'm just broadly going to look at the 4 umbrella ingredients from the Institute's methodology. And underneath these, there are more and more complicated factors, but at least this gives you a high level. Firstly, people. Don't get me wrong, people are the most important. The Institute does not conflict from that point of view. If you don't have great people, you're going to be in trouble. But people are a product of their environment, and that is why they are last in the sequence. They are most important, but they are last, because the lion is the king of the savannah, but you put him in the Arctic, he's dead in 30 minutes. And a polar bear is the king of the Arctic. You put him in the savannah, he's dead as well. And so people, their greatness and their skills and their strengths are actually a product of the environment that they're suited towards. And so you've first got to understand that, and you've got to sort of be able to know and develop that environment. And so the first ingredient isn't people. I will just say that what we do say about people, though, is to hire people that can command and grant mutual trust and respect. If you hire someone who can't command it in the way they behave or grant it to others, that's going to be a big problem. So the Institute does add that for people. The first ingredient really is managerial process. Managerial process being, how do you diagnose, that we spoke about in the earlier parts? How do we decide what to do? When people have a meeting, does everybody talk over each other? Do you go one at a time? Who's in charge? Who's not in charge? How do we then implement those decisions? How do we track them? How do we manage them? That's the first ingredient. And we always start, if we start working with an organization, is first start by demonstrating and transferring some of these processes to help them get better at diagnosing their issues, deciding what to do, and implementing them. Because you can have the best people on the planet, you can have the best strategy, you can have all the resources available, but if you can't identify your problems, if you can't diagnose your issues, if you can't make good decisions, and if you can't implement them, you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. And so we help organizations get those things in place and build a threshold level of capability and capacity to get that in, which then moves on to the next ingredient, the next sequence, which is really mission, vision, and values. Now, there's another webinar that I do on mission, because I think mission is another word with a lot of conflict that's been hijacked by some very well-meaning ideas. But often when we look at a lot of missions in organizations, they really are meaningless. They don't tell the staff what's changing, what's happening, what to do when, and all of those things. They're sort of more external marketing missions. And that's totally fine. But when we talk about mission, it's more internal, because what we need to do is create something that actually energizes the whole company. Think of that secret to success equation, and directs them, and directs energy, directs action, directs behavior. And so often when you look at a mission and you read it and the words are quite nice, if it's not really energizing and directing behavior in light of this change loop, we think that that there can be improvement. But ultimately, even if you have the greatest vision, mission, and even value set, it's going to be the structure that achieves it. And so mission and vision and structure, there's actually a sequence. First, we have to identify using the managerial process. But too often we'll see businesses and organizations with grand visions and missions and whatever else, but structurally don't have a hope of achieving it. The correct sequence is actually looking at structure. It's actually got to be first, but it's sort of in parallel, kind of. This is what we want to do. Do we have the structure? Okay, well, we need to first make structural changes in order to then achieve this mission. So there's quite a partnership there. And structure, again, is another area of conflict. For us, there are a number of broad things inside structure. There's roles and responsibilities, and inside roles and responsibilities is also time orientation, which is very important. If you give somebody short-term responsibilities and long-term in their time orientation, the short-term is always going to win. So often we'll see companies not managing long-term change-related issues because somebody's sitting there, I've got to deal with both short-term and long-term issues. Too much conflict. Authority is another big part of structure. Rewards is another big part of structure. And getting those aligned. So you have a mission that has a structure that's reinforcing the mission. The roles, the authorities, the rewards are reinforcing this mission. And then that's why people are fourth in the sequence. If you have really strong managerial process of how you diagnose, how do you decide, how do you implement, and a very clear internal mission of what to do in light of these changes and a structure that really drives home that mission, then finding the best person becomes far easier. That's when you get mutual trust and respect. If you don't have an alignment of those ingredients, if you just hire people and there is no process and different people don't care about the mission because it's not understood, and structurally you're all over the place, roles and responsibilities are conflicting with each other, people are coming onto each other's turf, you're not hiring the right people, that's going to lead to a culture that lacks mutual trust and respect. And so that's why for us, well, at least for me personally, and I think for the Institute, culture I prefer to define by what it produces. And what a good, strong culture produces is one that can solve problems really quickly and can capitalize on opportunities faster than their competitors. That's what a great culture does. How you do that is by building a culture of mutual trust and respect. And how you build a culture of mutual trust and respect is an alignment of these ingredients. But the problem is it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Those ingredients, unlike other traditional management theories, is not a one-size-fits-all. Problems and challenges are not equal. They're actually based on a life cycle. And so we've all seen the human life cycle. We've all experienced this: birth, infant, toddler, adult, all the way through to golden age. And unfortunately with humans, we all end up in the one spot, but organizations can actually cheat death. They can actually become what we call this prime thing if you do the right things in the right sequence. And so to highlight the problems aren't equal issue is that if I told you there was a toddler and that toddler cried all the time, didn't sleep through the night, wet itself, it's a toddler. What's the problem? There is no problem. The parent isn't going to get upset because there's this little baby that's constantly doing those things. The parent is going to help it move up the life cycle. Now, if it's the 34-year-old person still living with mum and dad, crying all the time, not sleeping through the night and wetting themselves, okay, we have a problem. So an issue that's a problem at one stage isn't a problem at another. And so organizations are the same. You actually have to understand where you are in the life cycle and say, hey, this is a normal problem. Oh, actually, no, this is an abnormal problem. And in my experience, not a lot of companies do it. And so here's the Adhesis organizational life cycle that matches very similarly. We have infancy. We have this go-go phase, which is a bit like a toddler where everything's exciting and they've got still huge flexibility. They can put their feet in their mouth, but they also have the tendency to jump onto couches and fall off their heads because they don't yet have the controls in place. And then we move through this adolescence phase, which is a very painful part of life, moving into prime. there's a whole nother webinar on deeper dive into the organizational life cycle that I won't go into today, but it's key to understand that normal problems are based on where you are in the life cycle. Abnormal problems are based on where you are in the life cycle. And then all these opportunities, priorities, goals, structure, leadership, measurements, rewards, all these things depends on where you are in the life cycle. And so these 4 ingredients to build mutual trust and respect is in respect to the life cycle. If you're an infant organization, the managerial processes, the mission, vision, and value, the structure, and the people that are required are very different to that of go-go, to adolescence, to prime, to fall, to aristocracy, so to speak. And ultimately, it's really important to understand that it's not one size fits all. And in the sequence, first understand, here are the 4 ingredients that are going to lead to mutual trust and respect. But actually, where am I in the life cycle? So then that way I can scale these ingredients properly. And so where do we start on this path to peak performance? Well, I sort of already gave it away a little bit earlier on. We start at number 1, the managerial process, deciding what to do, implementing it, starting with diagnosis. And it's this sequence. How do you identify your problems? Then categorize those problems. Prioritize those problems. Resolve those problems, which is really deciding and then implementing, and then doing it over and over again. And so what we help companies do is identify. We give them tools to categorize, give them tools to prioritize, help them with the resolution process so they can get faster and faster at doing this. And the broader DCIS approach is not to identify your problems for you, is not to tell you what your problems are and here's your solution, as many other consultants do. We are here to bring you tools that when we leave, you are functioning much better. So you can identify the problem, you can categorize, you can prioritize, you can resolve them. Because consultants that come into organizations to try and get things done find it incredibly difficult. And even if they do get something done, when the consultant leaves, normally all of that leaves with them. What a DCIS wants to do is to transfer the technology so you can, as an organization, harnessing all of these conflicts throughout this, identify, categorize, prioritize, and resolve. And if you can get faster and faster and better at doing that, then really the world just opens up in terms of the plans, the goals, the strategies, all the things that you can go after. And so that really is the path to peak performance. It's starting at the identify, categorize, prioritize, resolve. Now, the issue is it can be quite difficult to understand exactly how to do these things. And so for companies that are interested, we do a free 2.5-hour in-company pre-diagnosis section where we can share these concepts with the senior team. We can help demonstrate how you identify these problems and opportunities, give sort of an introduction into how they get categorized, and how you prioritize based on normal, abnormal, fatal. And the goal is that if you never engage with us ever again, you've learned something of value that is going to help the company manage that change. And for me personally, I'm passionate about getting organizations understanding that the faster it can manage change and those problems and opportunities and decide what to do and implement, the greater the likelihood they're going to be able to last and survive and thrive into the long-term future. So from my point of view, it's an investment I really enjoy doing. And so I would encourage people to take that up, and there are my details if you want to understand more. And I'd be really interested in any feedback via phone or via email, and just really look forward to hopefully adding some value and helping you in your journey. So thank you very much for joining this webinar, and hope to catch up with you soon. Thanks a lot.